So today, thanks Ren, by the way, we're going to be talking about those SAQs. So as you can probably see, I've got Kandyce with me today. Those of you who might be a little bit eagle-eyed have probably spotted that this was meant to be done with Lauren Holloway. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with, but Kandyce is she's with me on the data security standards team. She knows SAQ, so I'll probably say she's probably the best expert we've got to step in to do this, so that's fantastic. But what we're going to be doing, we're going to be giving you an update today about those SAQs. And a lot of this has been really focused on the feedback and questions we've been receiving from yourselves, and that's really going to be framing quite a lot of the things we could be discussing today. Now, as you probably know, there have been some changes to those SAQs, but again, a lot of them haven't really changed that much. For example, we've got SAQ A, EP, we've got BC, and the SAQ D for merchants, and they really haven't changed that much. But what we're going to do, we're going to walk through, for example, SAQ A and why did we add those new requirements. We're going to talk about the eligibility for SAQ BIP and CVT. And then we're going to touch on the SAQ D for service providers. And then what we're also going to do, we're going to give you a little bit of an insight into some really brand new documents we've published that are related to SAQs. So we'll save that for a bit later, and I'll tell you about them. And then we're just going to go over a couple of facts, hopefully, in this presentation that maybe you didn't know before this presentation. So starting off, we've got those kind of basic formatting changes. And if you remember how SAQs used to be, it used to be stated as a question. And when it's now all been changed in the new SAQs for version 4, they're stated directly as it is in PCI DSS. So as you can just see just on the screen here, we don't have those kind of yes/no responses in answer to those questions. We now have that kind of in place or not in place. Now, one thing I just want to mention here that we've got some of those SAQs. We've added some information and notes in there to explain more about the context of the SAQs. So, for example, if you might have paper storage, it's got information in there about how you should mark it, for example, as being not applicable if you don't use paper. So we've also reorganized and changed quite a lot of the sections in there. We've added more guidance. We've added some informational tables that are in PCI DSS. But anyway, hopefully you've all been reading those SAQs. So what we're going to do, though, we're going to start off with SAQ A.
So for e-commerce implementations, it's important to understand which SAQs apply to which payment method. So this chart here shows the variety of e-commerce methods that are applicable to the e-commerce or that are applicable to the SAQ. So whether it's A, AEP, or SAQ D for merchants. So the different merchant types that may be available for or eligible for SAQ A are these ones here, and that excludes, obviously, Moto, because Moto is not an e-commerce option. So the first option would be merchants with no access to their website, and that would be 11 requirements applicable there. Merchant websites that redirect their payments to a third-party service provider, let's say in a URL redirect scenario, that would be 27 requirements. And then merchants that host a third-party service provider's payment page or their form on their website via, let's say, an iframe implementation, and that's 29 requirements. And then we'd add notes to SAQ A to explain the different requirements that are applicable to each of the e-commerce implementations. But SAQ AEP, by contrast, with the merchant either creates the payment form and the account data that is directly delivered from the consumer browser to the third-party service provider, that's via direct post method, or the merchant website either loads and delivers a script that runs in the consumer browser via JavaScript. So SAQ AEP merchants, though, have partially outsourced, meaning all storage, processing, or transmission of account data is outsourced to a third-party service provider, a PCI DSS compliant one, but with their implementation, their website, they either control how the customers or their account data redirects to that compliant third-party service provider. So the two e-commerce methods that I mentioned are certainly much more risky than the SAQ A ones I mentioned, and this is why there's 139 requirements for this implementation. So SAQ D for merchants would be the only option for any other kind of e-commerce implementation.
Okay, so why those new requirements for SAQ A? Now, you might be wondering, all of the kind of account data it's being sent off, so a lot of storage, processing, and transmission, it's going to that compliant third-party service provider. Why do they have to do those additional steps? Well, we've been seeing a lot more SAQ A merchant breaches. And as a result, these new requirements have been added to try and protect these merchants. So what's really happening is, you've got the merchants, they might have vulnerabilities on their websites, and then the hackers are coming in and they're modifying basically the URL redirects, and they're sending that customer data off to the hackers' websites. And that is why we've added the ASV scans to SAQ A. And it's to help merchants not only find, but address those kind of basic website vulnerabilities. Now, one question we have been asked quite a lot is, will merchants need forward-passing scans when they flip over to do a SAQ A for PCI DSS version 4? And the answer is no. And we've actually got an FAQ on this. So FAQ 1485, it's what is the meaning of an initial assessment? And it explains it all there. So many SAQ A merchants are also being impacted by breaches that are targeting those websites that have iframes or embedded payment scripts. And these could be common chat functions that might be in there to help merchants in the payment process. But hackers are modifying those scripts. And again, similar to what I just discussed earlier, they're diverting that kind of payment card data to hacker websites. So what we've done, we've got new version 4 requirements that are protecting payment pages. And they focus directly on those iframes and third-party scripts to really protect against these threats. So the important part here is that the merchants now, you've got to manage those payment page scripts. So you've got to know the source, have only the ones that are needed for the payment functions, and importantly, to also manage the script's integrity. And that's basically to make sure they're not being changed. Now, it's worth noting here that those kind of third-party service providers that are managing iframes, they're also expected to be managing those scripts in the same way.
And so a little bit about SAQ BIP. We'll focus on one eligibility criterion specifically, and that's the standalone IP-connected PTS POI devices are not connected to any other systems within the merchant environment. So what does that mean? It means that for a merchant environment to be eligible for SAQ BIP, they must be in one of two scenarios. So the first is there are no connections to any other system within the merchant environment, and the IP connections to the processor are allowed and can have more than one IP connection to the POI device in the same network zone. Or if there's connectivity to other systems, that merchant implements network segmentation. So they must segment their network, isolate those systems from the merchant's cardholder data environment. But there's more on segmentation actually in PCI DSS version 4. I think it's page 11. It gives you a little bit more detail on the approaches for segmentation. But we've received several questions about what that term "are not connected" means in SAQ BIP. So we've got some diagrams to show.
Okay, so in this diagram, we've got one IP-connected, PTS-approved POI device that's connecting out to the processor. So this environment is going to be eligible for SAQ BIP. And then building on this, we've expanded the diagram. Now we've got two of those devices that are connecting out to the processor. They're both in the same network zone. It's still eligible for SAQ BIP. And then hopefully, if it clicks on, there we go. So in our third example we've got here, we've still got those two IP-connected, PTS-approved POI devices. They're connecting out to the processor in that kind of same network zone. But as you can see there, just in the corner, we've got that other merchant system. Now, this has been segmented from that network that has got those PTS-approved POI devices, so it is still eligible for SAQ BIP.
So connections that would not be considered eligible for SAQ BIP. So in this particular example here, there are two IP-connected PTS-approved POI devices connecting out to the processor on the same network zone. But there's also a cash register in the same network zone as the PTS POI devices. So as maybe you can guess by the big red X, this is not eligible for SAQ BIP because of that other merchant system in the same network zone. And in the last example, again, two IP-connected PTS approved POI devices connecting out to the processor on the same network zone. But there's also a non-PTS POI device in the same network zone as the approved PTS devices. So the big red X again there indicates this is not eligible for SAQ BIP because of that non-PTS POI approved device that shares the same network zone. But it would be eligible for SAQ BIP if it was an approved PTS device that was either a different model or a different vendor. As long as the device is in the same network zone, all have PTS approved POI devices, then that would be SAQ BIP.
Okay, so moving on then to SAQ CVT. And now this is intended for those merchants that are manually entering account data from a computer browser into a third-party virtual payment terminal solution, and they're using an isolated computing device and a securely connected web browser. Now, that merchant has no connections to other merchant locations or systems, and the internet connection is going off to that PCI DSS compliant third-party service provider. Now, it's quite a lot to get over there, so again, we've got some diagrams. So here, hopefully you can see what I just described. We've got the account data entering into that securely connected web browser, and that's connected out to that compliant third-party service provider's virtual payment terminal. So this is going to be eligible for SAQ CVT.
So connections that would not be considered eligible for SAQ CVT. So in this case, we can see a variety of people working on a network. They're all entering account data into their securely connected web browser. But it's from the same company, the organization. It's not a third-party service provider that they're sending the data to. So it's not eligible for CVT because there are other connected systems and the computing devices are not isolated, and because they're not connected to a third-party service provider's virtual payment terminal solution. Same picture as the previous one with a group of people on a network, and now there's also an employee connecting remotely from home. They're all entering the same account data into their securely connected web browser. But again, they're connected to a system that is part of their company, not a third-party service provider's. And so they're not eligible for CVT because there are other connected systems and those computing devices are not isolated, and also because they're not connected to a third-party service provider's virtual payment terminal solution.
Okay, now bear with me when I say this now. I'm going to be talking about things that don't exist. So, first of all, don't exist as far as I'm aware. Flying pigs don't exist. Genies in bottles don't exist. And beautiful unicorns with rainbow manes. And finally, SAQ A for service providers. So, I just want to point out here that the only SAQ is going to be SAQ D for service providers, and it causes a lot of confusion, but it's quite simple. So, Kandyce.
So SAQ D, as John said, SAQ D for service providers is the only eligible SAQ for service providers. And to clarify this, we've added a concept to all of the SAQs just to say, this SAQ is not eligible for service providers. So a service provider undergoing an assessment for services it offers, it can't meet the eligibility of the other SAQs. Why? Because they're not merchants. So even if a given requirement is not applicable to a merchant using that service provider, for example, if they're a firewall or other network security control service provider, those requirements are most likely still applicable to the service provider, and they're expected to be included in that service provider's PCI DSS assessment when they tell their merchant that, yes, they are PCI DSS compliant. So the expectation is that for service providers, they must be compliant with all of the PCI DSS requirements, not only those that apply to the merchants that they're servicing. And also, there are service provider-only requirements in SAQ D for service providers, and none of those requirements are found in the merchant SAQs. So if there are requirements in a service provider's environment that are truly not applicable, let's say they don't apply in the environment at all, then that service provider could potentially mark it as not applicable, and there is an appendix at the back where they can describe that. So there were some new things that were added to SAQ D for service providers in version 4, additional documentation that's required. And why would that be? Well, because service providers can have a huge impact on a lot of organizations, right? They're connected. They do services on behalf of hundreds, if not thousands of different organizations. So the expectations are inherently higher. And so that's why we require this additional documentation. So new bits have been added, such as a new section 2.A for network diagrams, as well as information about storage of account data in SAD, as well as a section for quarterly scan results. And for each PCI DSS requirement, the service provider is also expected to describe the results. And there's a little section that tells you how to perform that describe the results portion.
Okay, so I mentioned just at the start a couple of new publications related to SAQs. Now, these literally came out last Friday. So we're having a little bit more communications that you'll be going out, telling people out. So it's a bit like breaking news for you, so get a bit excited. So what we've got the new instructions and guidelines. And what this document has done, I mean, some of you might be aware we had the previous one for version 3.2.1. Well, what we've done, we've updated it, but we've also incorporated in that understanding SAQs for version 3. And it's actually got a lot of information that we've actually included in today's presentation. So, for example, what types of e-commerce methods are eligible for SAQ A and AEP. But interestingly, it also has a part in there, and what it is, we've got a brand new SAQ, and it touches on it in this document, and that is the SAQ for SPoC. To give it its full title, it's the software-based pin entry on commercial off-the-shelf devices. So, Kandyce, can you tell our audience a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So the new SAQ for SPoC has almost the same amount of requirements as the SAQ for P2PE. And they're both intended for merchants that use a validated and PCI listed solution. So since the solution provider is implementing the security controls required, that inherently minimizes the amount of requirements that PCI DSS merchant or that merchant must complete for PCI DSS. So you can see here how SPoC differs from P2PE, completely different payment devices. So for P2PE, it's a PTS approved POI device with a PDS function for encryption, like SRED. And for SPoC, it's a merchant COTS device, either a phone or a tablet, and a PTS SCRP that attaches to the phone for secure PIN processing. Very different types of devices for each, and that's why we have two completely separate SAQs for them.
Okay. Future SAQs. Now, we've been asked quite a bit about an SAQ for MPOC solutions. And the short answer is, where we're up to it, not yet. But there's a reason for this. I mean, currently, we don't have any listed MPOC solutions. So as a direct result, there's no need for merchants to be using MPOC solutions because we don't have any yet. So just to give a little bit of background information on this, what we've recently done, we've finalized the onboarding programs for the labs, and we've started now to evaluate, or they've started to evaluate those MPOC solutions. And it's taken a little bit of time to gather this information, not only from the labs, but the vendors as they're going through this evaluation process. So once there is a listed solution, what we're going to do, we'll take all that information in that we've got from the labs and the vendors, and we'll look at going forward with the development of that MPOC SAQ. So in short, stay tuned. It's in the works. So pretty short going through today. I just want to say, hopefully some of this has given you a little bit of insight into some of the SAQs that we have and some of the reasons, certainly for the eligibility and the information that we have in there. So I just want to say thank you to Kandyce, especially for stepping in last minute to get this done, and hopefully that will have been informative. If you've got any questions you want to ask us, please feel free to come up after this presentation and have a chat with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.